Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Lockdown Dads. My name's Ian Dinwiddie, and I'm the founder of a business called Inspiring Dads, who helps stressed dads to balance work and fatherhood. I've got two kids. I've got a 10-year-old daughter and a 7-year-old son.
And I'm James Miller, editor of workingdads.co.uk and author of Dads Don't Babysit, and also a father of two different children. And I'm delighted to say that our guest today is Steve Myall, who completes the circle of podcasting because he is the founder of the First Time Dads podcast when he was at the Mirror. And Ian found me after hearing me on that podcast. And here we are now with our own podcast, and Steve's the guest, and he is now in New York as a a freelance journalist and a full-time dad. So very glad, very welcome along, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I feel like Cilla Black.
Let's start with the question that we always start with, which, as we always say, used to be like a really boring question, but is now like massively loaded. How are you?
Yeah, I listened to some of your previous podcasts, and I think that I'm probably like everyone else, which is doing okay, but have become used to this new normality, and it's taken a little bit of a few bumps on the road to get to this kind of lockdown. I mean, obviously it's slightly different in New York to the UK at the moment, but yeah, this idea that we couldn't go out and switching a house for an apartment, and when we made that decision, not realising quite what that would mean, that would be in it 24 hours a day. But yeah, okay, I'll hold my hand up and say there's been some tough times, but I think can see light at the end of the tunnel. I think is the right way. I was checking the New York state website yesterday to see when I might get my vaccine, and the governor seems to be suggesting maybe in the summer, which is as somebody who is relatively healthy and not in any of the risk groups, is definitely light at the end of the tunnel.
That's a discussion. That's for another podcast, that discussion about vaccines. One that I was having in the virtual pub last night, having a lengthy discussion about vaccines and whether we're going to get them and when and all that sort of stuff. But
what order? Yeah, I had the conversation this morning as well on the call. Yeah, didn't want to go there.
Talking about. Well, yeah, okay. Then I don't know. Maybe that'll feed into your answer too, Ian. Maybe not. How are you?
Not too bad. Yeah, it's homeschool's actually going pretty smoothly, like it was like or remote homeschool remote learning, as John Adams, previous guest, was keen to point out today on this week on social media, which I think is absolutely right. It's not homeschool per se; it's kind of remote learning. And my son's still pretty much, apart from a wobble around lunchtime today, where he was somewhat disappointed by the choice of type of bread that was put on his plate. And then it's been going pretty smoothly. Big highlight this week: my cat Boris, the famous Boris, who occasionally turns up and is referenced in this podcast. He lost use of his legs at the start of December last year suddenly, and we thought it was something quite long-term and possibly inoperable issue with the spine. Was given a clean bill of health, and we avoided getting an MRI scan, having to get an MRI scan to confirm that, because we don't have insurance, and he would have burnt through pretty much all his insurance allowance money. So Boris, the 12-year-old cat, 11.5-year-old cat, is given a clean bill of health, and we thought we were going to lose him this year, quite frankly. And you never know with cats, but yeah, great weight off our mind, because he's a big part of the family.
Great.
Yeah, a lot to be said about pets in lockdown and all the rest of it. I mean, again, I don't know. It's not really. Let's not get bogged down in that, because there's so much I do want to talk to Steve about. But whether you're allowed, anybody in New York has pets.
Everyone's got dogs. No one has cats.
Okay.
There are no cats. I saw a cat the other day, and the bloke was walking on a lead in Central Park.
Oh, okay. I mean,
Wow.
There's weirder things you see in New York, isn't it? But that's pretty well up there. I'll just complete the series without anybody asking. It's all right. I mean, we've been doing this stuff. I know what you're going to say, and I know what you're going to tell you. That's how it works, right? I don't know. Yeah, I think, strangely enough, my son was also complaining about the choice of bread at lunchtime. That's a bit weird, isn't it? Didn't like the 50-50. He's all wholemeal these days. So yeah, I mean, but there you go. If that's all you've got to worry about at the moment, then I think you're probably doing pretty well. And I think, I think last week, my brain was pretty well scrambled by the sudden homeschooling and everything. I think at the end of this week, I'm beginning to, this is very optimistic this week, isn't it? But I'm beginning to feel like, I can get a handle on this and I can see what's going on. God alone knows what we're going to do at the weekend. I feel like work I've got a handle on. It's like, right, we've got a weekend. What do you do at the weekend when you can't do anything? But that's a discussion for, I don't know, tomorrow morning in bed when I'm like, what's the getting up again? But so yeah, sounds like we're all quite perky this week. That's a good sign. And there's lots I want to talk about with Steve, not least because you're in America and I want to know about, America and dads is like, whoa. But let's do the sort of the journey. Let's talk about how you came to be doing what you're doing, because you had a high profile, high pressure job at the Mirror.
Yeah, I was editor at the Mirror. I'd been at the Mirror for 10 years when I left, but previously to that done other stints at Sunday newspapers, Mail on Sunday, etc. But I've got two kids, Iris, who's 2.5, and Jackson, who's 4.5. And when we were sort of thinking about having kids, my wife and I, we had a friend who took some shared parental leave, and I knew nothing about it at the time. And we saw him during it, and he was in his shorts, he'd grown a beard, he was relaxed, he was chilled. And since then, the relationship with him and it's his second child, looked fantastic. And I thought, well, let's look into this. I fancy this if we get the opportunity. And we were lucky enough to not have any problems having kids. And I was back at work and thought, well, I'm going to do this. We were fortunate to be able to afford it, because anyone that knows anything about it, there's an economic impact on you taking it. And I took 3 months off. At the end, well, I took 3 months away from work, so it's not really 3 months off. At the end of the 12 months, that's sort of traditionally, if you like, the maternity break and my wife went back to work 9 months, and it was great. Loved it. Just really started off with, my wife giving me a timetable of what to do, and then I was like, after a week, I was like, I can do this, and had a really great time, and became a real advocate for it. And I think and I'll say it to anybody who will listen, I think it's the best thing you can do as a dad. And I think there are barriers to being able to do it, of course, but I think, with planning, and you can do some version of it. And then we'll have a second child, little girl Iris, again, and the effect of it made me change the way I thought about my work, about how long I wanted to spend there. So I went to reduced hours, or condensed hours, and had a day off, again, not really a day off every week, and just sort of changed completely how I viewed anyone that knows anything about journalism. It can take your time, and it can take your stress, and it can take it can be unrelenting if you let it. And I decided that I didn't want that, certainly not while they were tiny. And it sort of led into everything, really. I mean, that's part of the reason we made the move to New York, was that I was content to leave my secure, in inverted commas, staff job at a national newspaper, come to the States and allow my wife to follow a great career opportunity and be comfortable to be at home, looking after the kids and making decisions about what they're doing, and actually enjoy it as well. And actually, it's only when you take a stop and you look around to see how many other people are doing it, you realize how unusual it is to do. And especially, as you alluded to, in the States, and especially in New York, and especially in Manhattan, and especially in the Upper West Side, which is where we live. So everything I talk about, you ask me questions from this point, and I should caveat with, we live in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So it's a particular, I live 50 meters from Central Park. And we were surrounded by these are the rents are extortionate. We've got a doorman. It's that kind of life. That we're not quite in the Tom Wolfe sort of area yet, but it's that kind. You look around and people have dogs in handbags, and it's that kind of thing. So everything I talk about, how much stuff costs and thing here, is we are in the most expensive part of the most expensive city. So. But yeah, so that's my journey, really. And when I was at the Mirror, we decided that we were going to do a podcast. So a colleague of mine who just had a baby as well, because we felt that dads weren't really talking, or didn't have a forum to talk about. It increasingly became the mental elements of it rather than the practical stuff. But how's it all going? Was a conversation that you'd have in the pub, but you wouldn't have it in a big group, because dads didn't really talk about stuff, or didn't feel like they did anyway. And that's where the podcast, we did 100 episodes of the podcast, had some great guests. James was on twice. And really kind of opened my ears and mind to parenting, and that there is not a one size fits all. There's lots of different versions of it. You have to pick the right version for the environment that you're in. Not all kids are created equal, not all parents are created equal, not all family setups. But spending time with your kids is not time wasted.
And what was the reaction like to that podcast? Because as you say, I was on it twice. I think I still retain
So I still get emails. I still get messages on Twitter. People coming to it for the first time. I mean, we suffered a little bit because of the sound quality at the beginning, but it was really well received. We were nominated for best podcast in the podcast awards. We had lots of people coming to us wanting to be on it because it had this particular reach to dads, and we had no difficulties getting guests at all, because it was something new. And I think you look and see, you've done a podcast about fatherhood on the back of it. There's a guy called Nigel Clark, who's a kids TV presenter, who was on it, and he's done a podcast on the back of it. Tim Vincent is the former Blue Peter presenter, has got a Radio 4 show about being dads now, and he was on it. It seemed to be at the right time. It was so I feel a little bit sad that we weren't able to continue it, but it seemed like there was a lot of interest in it, and I think it's been great to look back on and still get those positive messages.
Yeah, the demand, isn't there? That's the thing that wasn't being fulfilled, and obviously you plugged that gap, but I'm still plugging it because obviously the podcasts live on online forever.
We're getting I think 1,000 a month, and we haven't done a podcast for coming up for 2 years.
Wow.
One
day, James. One day.
That's the answer. We need to stop making these, and then people will start listening to
them. keep the kudos. Yeah. Whether we'll get to 100, we're hoping. I mean, it's the thing we joke about, Steve, is we're hoping that Lockdown Dads as a podcast, or at least the name Lockdown Dads, will cease to be relevant at some stage. Yeah. And I guess that, in terms of your experience, you talked earlier about swapping a house in London for an apartment in New York, and for all those glamorous side of things, how's that been? Because presumably were you in New York at the height of the start of the pandemic?
Yes, we arrived in November 2019. So we went into a temporary apartment for 6 weeks, and then we moved into this apartment. And we were just getting our feet under the table, if you like. Grandma had come over to visit and had a first Christmas in New York, and we were just starting to kind of hit the ground, so to speak. And the kids Iris was due to start some kind of childcare, and I was starting to look around to think what I'm going to do work-wise. And then suddenly things shut down, and we look back on it now, like you guys did, think, well, there was talk of a virus in China, and no one actually thought it was. No one really thought. Well, my wife works for the UN in the humanitarian section, so even she was like, we're doing stuff on this, but it hasn't quite. And then suddenly New York's in this epicenter. These figures are soaring. There's a field hospital in Central Park. The schools are shut. Everyone's afraid to leave their apartment. We had Jackson's birthday's on the 6th of March, and I think lockdown came in for us a week later. He had a birthday party, and we were joking, this is like a COVID party, we need to be careful. Someone had said they had a cough on a plane back from San Francisco, and the kids are all, it's like kids' birthday parties, if you can remember, they're all picking up each other's biscuit, and they're drinking out of the same cups, and everyone's blowing can you imagine people blowing candles out on a birthday cake again? We wear masks. So it was suddenly we had not really that many friends in New York, or not really a couple of couples that we knew, and we were like, oh my goodness, we're at home, we're in this apartment, this is tough, how are we going to do this? And it's cold in March in New York. It can get down to minus double figures. And so you can't just tip them out into the garden if you're on the 7th floor of an apartment. You can't take them, the playgrounds are shut. all of the activities the kids were doing, you know, gymnastics and ballet and those kinds of things, all that shut. The playroom in our building, that shut. So we just decided that we were going to try and get ourselves out of the city for a weekend, just because it was sort of like it was like a boiling point in the kettle, if you know what I mean. We were like, what do we do? So we went out for like a weekend up to the Pocono Mountains in Pennsylvania. Stayed in like basically the cabin in the woods, and it was fantastic. You know, there were deer roaming around. We saw bear came through the garden, and we were like, this is fantastic. So from that point on, we were like, we're going to go for another 2 weeks. We're going to go for 2 weeks, then we come back another 2 weeks away, and we just kept going out of the city, within the state, so just up to the Catskill Mountains, and it just gave us this idea of space, which is what we missed, and that really helped, I think, for everyone's mental health. And you know, my wife was working from home remotely up there, so I was doing the childcare, but it just this ability to walk outside, and just to take some air and just have that break, and not. Because when you're in the apartment, you've got to go out the front door, down the corridor, into the lift, down 7 stories, through the foyer, out onto the street, and then you're out onto the streets of New York. You're not going to. It's not a wilderness environment. It's, you know, it's hustle bustle. But yeah, so it was tough. It was tough to start with, but I think we were able to make some adjustments to our lifestyle to enable that to be a bit better. And you know, of course, we started to put the kids in front of the TV a lot more, which obviously I'm sure everyone did to a degree. And over here, you know, you got Disney, Netflix, and the kids were like, you know, it just buys you an hour's worth of headspace. But yeah, so that's basically how it all worked for us. I mean, yeah, we were fortunate in the sense that because my wife works for the UN, we've got a diplomatic status here, so that we were able to come back to the UK. Which a lot of my people that I've met over here who are British haven't been able to do. So I'm on a WhatsApp group which is called Real Dads of New York, Real Brit Dads of New York, and it tends to be guys that work for financial institutions, but they haven't been able to go back home because their visas don't allow them to go backwards and forwards. So they've had like 18 months, some of them, without seeing grandparents. So we were able to go back for a month in August to see grandma. Of course, we had to do the 14-day quarantine when we came back to the UK. Then we were able to see grandma for like 2 weeks, who was shielding, so couldn't really see anyone else. Then had 3 days in London to see our friends, and then came back to New York and had another 14 days quarantine. But you do what you do. We're lucky enough to be able to have that opportunity to make that move and see family. So we did it. And you know, it seems then when we got back, it was the summer and the playgrounds opened. And I don't know you know much about New York playgrounds, but they are phenomenal. You know, they're water fountains, and it makes the parks of southeast London knocks them into a cocked hat. I think if you.
Whoa! You go New York being old Charlie Big Potato slagging off parts of southeast London now. Too fancy.
I'm not slagging
Crystal Palace, are you now?
One's a different level. But that's because
come back on your diplomatic passport. You just stay there with your fancy playgrounds. Have you got Crystal Palace? Have you got a Sphinx? Have you got a big dinosaur with its face fallen off? Have you got that? Because if you haven't got that, you can't compete with Crystal Palace. All right.
I love Crystal Palace Park. I used to live there.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things just about moving to America like that. I mean, yeah, I've got friends in America, and absolutely, obviously they're not on diplomatic passports, and that is, you really feel for them that when everything shut down, you know, they couldn't come back. First of all, you're talking about going to the Catskills Mountains and stuff, and that's what people in films do. I mean, come on, moving to America, do you not just sometimes sit in New York and think, you know, what, I'm in a film set essentially? But perhaps more importantly, what's it like? I mean, it's interesting you say you're in a WhatsApp group of dads, of Brit dads as well. You know, what have you noticed in terms of the differences for dads? Because as you say, you took shared parental leave, right? Yep. I'm assuming that's not happening in America because they don't even have paternity leave, and yet maybe the banks do offer that. I mean, what is it like being a dad in America?
So there's I did a bit of research because you said you were going to ask about this, so I thought I'd look into it a little bit before we spoke. And from my understanding, is there is a federal law which allows you to have 12 weeks of unpaid parental leave as a dad. but obviously that unpaid bit is the key bit. And because the culture over here is even further behind the UK, the effect on your career, I think people have got bigger concerns about the effect on their career in the US than they have. I think there's only maybe, someone said there's like 80 million people that's possible for, because of the way that the legislation is drawn. It's down to individual companies. Now, I know the dads that I know tend to have older kids. So these guys in this WhatsApp group tend to have older kids, and they are, working for JP Morgan and etc. So they're different sort of lifestyle, I think, to us. But it's down to the individual companies. I think some of those companies, you'll know better than me probably, which of those companies probably offer parental leave. I think if you work for Google, you're probably all right. Or your Facebook, you're probably all right. Apple, probably all right. I think some of the other companies, maybe not so much. And particularly if you're, maybe working medical at the moment, it would be hard to take time away.
Yeah.
One of the dads on the group's like a surgeon in New York, and I think he's been pretty busy.
That's an understatement, I suspect. Yeah. I mean, do you notice a sort of cultural difference around fatherhood and being a sort of?
So I would say, and again, going back to what I said, we're talking about Manhattan, we're talking about Upper West Side. When we arrived, I would take the kids to classes, so gymnastics, ballet, swimming. First thing I'd say is they're a lot more expensive over here. So you remember that app that used to exist, which I think is now sadly closed, called Hoop in the UK, where you could book classes. You go for like half an hour, like athletic class. It costs like £10. Over here, that's 40 quid for that half an hour. So like you're talking 4 times as much the price, and you have to sign up for these things for a whole term. You can't just do it ad hoc. I'd find it very unusual where I would go. Not only would it be unusual for me to see a dad taking their kids to this stuff, it would be unusual for me to see a parent, because they're all nannies. I'd say I'd be the only man and probably the only parent, and I'd certainly be, not that this necessarily matters, but it just gives you an idea, I'd be the only person of the same ethnicity as the child that I'm with. So a lot of the nannies are, they don't live in Upper West Side, or if they do, they live in, and they've got their own community. I'm a white middle class middle-aged man, and they're they're talking in Spanish to each other, and I'm not part of that group. So that was an interesting thing for me to see. And then you'd see dads dropping off kids at nursery, but it's on the fly. You haven't got time to like stand and have a chat. I've noticed it's changed a lot since lockdown coming. You see a lot more dads doing drop off and pick up, because obviously they're working from home. And the other thing I've noticed is that it's that classic thing that you go to the playground at the weekend, and there's the weekend dad, the helicopter dad, the dad that doesn't spend, that probably doesn't see their kids from Monday to Friday because they're the hours that they work. And then at the weekend, they've suddenly got little Johnny in the playground who is climbing up this climbing frame, and they're like, be careful, be careful, be careful. Like, we call it helicopter parenting. And this kid's fine. I've seen this kid in the playground all week, and he's been fine. And the slightest trip or the slightest interaction between another kid, the dads aren't as relaxed, I would say. Or there'd be, that's the main difference with dad. I haven't really seen too many dads. I've met one dad who's a stay-at-home dad, who lives a few blocks away, who's got 2 kids, but they took a very different approach during lockdown to us. So the kids didn't go out, didn't go to playgrounds. So we didn't spend any time with them because they were just staying in all the time. But yeah, that's the sort of the main dad difference, I'd say, is that you just don't see them. You just don't see them during the day.
Is that driven by, is that driven by the culture or by the, the workplace, if you like? Because if there's no, over here, right, you've got obviously your 2 weeks statutory paternity, which is paid, which is rubbish, but at least the state is saying you probably ought to be around for a couple of weeks. After that, get to work. But in America, there's not even that.
I don't think there's a culture of it. I think there's a culture of the culture of it when the kids get a little bit older, that they take their kids on camping trips and that kind of stuff. But I feel like in the Upper West Side or in Manhattan, there's a removal from parents and kids, that they're not as close in a way, because there's this nanny that looks after them. The nanny, the mum and dad go to work in the morning, the nanny comes in, looks after the kids all day, gives the kids their 3 meals, does all the discipline during the day, and then puts them to bed, and then mum and dad might come in when they come and give them a kiss goodnight. There's a reason that there's these books like The Goldfinch and stuff written about this kind of like very rarefied parenting distance between the kids and their parents, because that's how it is. Not all of them, of course. And
No.
If I talk to the guys that work on the door and stuff here, they have they don't live in Upper West Side. If they live in New Jersey, it's a different thing, or maybe Queens and the Bronx, it's a slightly more community parenting. But certainly where we are, it feels like the kids are being looked after rather than being parented.
And then the adults all have a shrink, right? Because that's what you have.
Yeah.
And two might be connected. I don't know. I might be a bit simplistic, but there might be a connection there.
Maybe.
It's almost like Jacob Rees-Mogg has come in and designed kind of early years parenting and interaction with the kids.
Yeah.
It's sort of almost an old-fashioned sort of upper-class British.
Well, it's interesting actually. A lot of the schools, not the public schools, but the private schools, they are kind of aping this British public school, this idea about morning prayer and the uniforms and the blazers. It's very much trying to copy a British education system. A lot of the schools, the private schools over here, were created by British people who came to America and brought their education expertise, if you like. And America's desperate for history, as we know, because it hasn't got any really. And so they have like coats of arms, and the schools have coats of arms, and the flags, and they want to, on their mission statement, traces it back as far as it can possibly go.
Now, the clock's popped up saying we've got a limited time left, so it's maybe not time to drop in this question. But I mean, the reason we wanted to get you on the podcast anyway, Steve, but we particularly wanted to do it now because it's inauguration week by the time this gets out. So we've still got to cover off tips. So you've basically got about 2 minutes to cover what's it like in America just now. What is beyond just fathers? What is the atmosphere, and how does it feel to be there?
I went away with a friend for a weekend, and we came back the day that the election result was announced, and we drove back into New York as the election result came over the radio. And people were out on the street opening bottles of champagne, cheering on street corners. Cars tooting their horns, which tells you everything about this part of New York's feeling about who won and feelings towards Trump. People here are insulated from it. That you talk to the man in the street and they shake their head about Trump, and I think there's a feeling that it's going to be okay. And I think those people that stormed the Capitol are so far removed from the people that I'm surrounded with that there's the same lack of understanding that you probably have looking at it from London that you do looking at it from New York. But there's also underpinning everything this right to do what you want, which you get in America, which you don't really have in the UK. There's this, I've got a right to express myself and do what I want, which is ironic because the way that people have reacted to the constrictions about wearing masks and stuff seem to be in New York. They've accepted it a lot more than perhaps looking backwards, people not accepting it quite in the same way in the UK. Heard on the Radio 4 the other day, people still talking about wearing masks in supermarkets. You can't go into a shop here without a mask. You will not be allowed in. If you walk through Central Park, which is one of the biggest urban parks in the world, without wearing a mask, outside you will be shouted at. Wearing a mask. If you go jogging or cycling, you've got to wear a mask. So yeah, we're waiting. You know, I think there's a little bit of nervous anticipation, but I think that overall people are positive that things are going to be okay.
I can draw this back to dads, because I just blogged on workingdads.co.uk saying that exactly that we're getting rid of a man in the White House who represented all things bad about masculinity and was not on board with the things that we believe in, like equality and empathy and inclusivity. And we're getting a man who does believe in that. So there is a connection to the dad's agenda and what's going on in the White House, I think. We are running out of time horribly. So I've got a very quick tip. We'll move on to the tips. It's go and watch Soul, the new Disney movie. Not the best movie ever, I have to say, despite some of the reviews I saw, but possibly the best lockdown movie ever, with its message of, just take pleasure in the ordinary, essentially. So that's my tip for this week. Ian, do you want to give us your tip?
I'll second Soul as well. A great film. I unfortunately fell asleep slightly in New Year's Eve watching it, so I need to re-watch it. But it was beautiful and really heartfelt. Chocolate orange. My tip for this year: chocolate orange is not just for Christmas. Okay, I think Terry's chocolate orange, often associated with Christmas and hamper. James, if you're on the podcast, James is looking at me with amusement. We haven't had a chocolate tip for ages. But you can get chocolate oranges are amazing. They also come in bars, which I didn't realize, and mini pieces. My daughter loves them nearly as much as I do. I cannot buy chocolate orange fast enough at the moment, but not just for Christmas.
Well, that was unexpected, I have to say. That's usually the sort of rubbish I come out with, and you come out with the more sensible, actually useful tip. Steve, have you got a tip for dads?
I've been doing mindfulness. I know you guys have talked about it in the past. I've been doing that. That's got me through. My Andy Puddicombe, I think his name is, who runs the Headspace empire. Just 10 minutes. 10 minutes, not every day, but 10 minutes when it changes the dynamic of the day. And I think you said the other day on one of the podcasts, if you just take a minute to breathe, they're the good days. And I think that's absolutely right. It sounds like, something that I hadn't really thought about before all this, but it's, really worthwhile, because if you can't get out of the house, then you can just take a minute or 5 minutes, even if when the kids have gone to bed, or if you wake up in the night and do it, it's transformative. And also craft is 2021 craft box, a big plastic box full of sticky stuff, paper, paints. That is my fallback parenting position. If nothing else works, get the craft box out, be prepared to clear up the mess, but that will solve almost any argument.
I mean, that is a hell of a night. We've got do a minute of mindfulness and then get yourself a chocolate orange and watch Soul. You are going to feel better at the end of that evening. That is a cracking. That is a recipe for contentedness, I'd say.
So, Steve, so remind us, the podcast is First Time Dads, and that's still available.
Yeah, iTunes,
all good podcast outlets. And also, if people want to follow you on Twitter and your musings in America, where's your Twitter handle?
Twitter at Steve Myall Eats, and on Instagram at Steve Myall Eats HQ.
Cool. We will put those links in the comments below. Steve, thank you very much for joining us from New York and telling us all about the glamour of living just 50 meters from Central Park on Upper West Side, and some of the pressures and challenges of lockdown. Thank you everyone for joining us. This was episode number 29 of Lockdown Dads. We will be back next week for another episode, but in the meantime, please do like, share and subscribe, and we will see you all again next week. Thank you very much, Steve.
No worries.